Again, let me welcome each one of you. I'm so pleased that I know you had a choice as to what to do with this precious part of your life. And as I've said so often, I take very, very seriously that you've chosen that our lives could touch tonight. So welcome to St. Luke's, welcome to the table, and welcome to our time together. Let's rest our lives and our very selves in the presence of God. Let us pray. Dearest God, we come this night with grateful hearts for our health, for each other, for the gift of the gospel. We come also with hearts that are hungry for hope, wanting the energy that will enable us to meet our own needs, but also be of use to your suffering creation. May your Spirit move through us like a gentle breeze. May you speak to us in ways that will be refreshing, like a cup of cold water. And may we have the openness that will enable your incredible grace to enter further in and deeper on into the very depths of our being. We love you and give you thanks for creating us. You have promised to provide. May these next few moments be caught up in your great desire to bless. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. I think most of you know by now that I have chosen the reality of hope as the kind of centerpiece for our 5-part Lenten series. And I said to the group that was here on the first night that I really myself have a great desire to deepen my capacity for hope. The whole idea for this series was actually triggered by just a simple sentence that I read somewhere, and that was, expect something good to come out of every situation. And I recognized in that something that I really would like to achieve, and yet something that is not an exact description of the way the insides of my life always work. And so it is the desire to become more hopeful, the desire to find authentic resources that can enable me to anticipate what I do not know, because the future is not known to any of us, to learn to live in hopefulness rather than in dread. Since we don't know the future, we really do have a choice, and I think all of us need to be given resources and encouragement to try to live our lives out of a sense of hope. Now, I'm not going to cover the ground that I have already covered, except to say that I've tried to build rather carefully in the first 2 talks certain characteristics of this reality. I've suggested again and again that I believe hope is essential. Hope is the energy that animates our kind of species. When you have lost hope, you've lost the ability to move. You've lost the ability to have the energy and the fuel of life. And I had suggested that a hospital chaplain once said that he felt at the bottom of most expressions of mental illness was the specter of hopelessness. That the thing that makes people sick is when somehow they have lost touch with a lively sense of the future, that there is some prospect out ahead to which we can look with a great deal of excitement. So I don't think we have to argue that the reality of hope is utterly essential. What air and food and water are to the physical organism, I believe it's fair to say that hope is to our spirits. I've also suggested that hope is reality-based. Some writers say that the great challenge is to keep hopelessness from contaminating hope. And what they mean is that hope is not absolute, that there are some things that it is positively futile to hope for, because they are not reality-based, that they are not within the realm of the possible. And therefore I like the definition of hope, that hope is something that is possible that has not yet become manifest in history. There are latent potentials in the real that give us the basis of hope. But as I've said, to hope to never die, to hope to never age, those kinds of hopes are fantasies. And therefore we don't serve the important function of hope by letting hopelessness and hope contaminate each other. There are things that hopelessness does have its place. There's some things, because of the limits of reality, that to exercise wishes on is simply to make a mistake. Which leads me to the third thing I said, that genuine hope always involves from our side the capacity of wishing. Again, what is so often found in the mentally ill is that they've stopped wishing for anything. They've stopped desiring, that they no longer have any sense of life and any sense of reaching out into the future. And I have tried to say that unlike Buddhism, Christianity encourages us to get in touch with the desires of our heart. What it also encourages us is to desire above all things, in addition to our preferences, to desire above all things that God's will be done. What Jesus did in Gethsemane was to identify his own wishes, let this cup pass from me, but then pass his wishes over into better and wiser and more ingenious hands and say, nevertheless, not what I wish, but what you wish. And so it is so important that we not give up on the idiosyncratic desires and preferences of our lives. That's our part of the process. And the other thing I've been trying to say is that I don't know of any authentic experience of hope that does not involve a belief that there is help beyond us that we can tap into and we can access. Hope is not something that is totally subjective. It is not something that I can do all by myself in a vacuum. Truth be told, the way to live hopefully is to have a profound trust that there are energies beyond us, energies over which we have no control, that do have our good at heart. I honestly believe that reality does care whether we sink or swim. It does prefer that we swim. It does prefer that not only we survive, but that we grow into the fullness of our potential. And therefore, back in ancient uses of the language, the words hope and help were often used interchangeably. I told you about serving in a little mountain community when I was a Baptist seminarian. And these people had been pretty well isolated for 200 years since they'd come over from England. And it was not uncommon for those mountaineers to say to me, I would like to help you out. And what they meant by that was, I really would like to be of help to you. So hope and help come from the same verbal root. And they also, I think, are very intrinsically tied, because if I'm going to live hopefully, I have got to have some kind of confidence that beyond myself there are people and there is the divine energy that can help me in my times of trouble. Which leads me to what I want to talk to you about tonight, which is to try to refine the kinds of expectations that we can have around this subject of help. Back in the early 1960s, I had something happen that made a very profound impression on me. An older mentor of mine, a man who taught at the Baptist Seminary, gave me a little book entitled A Grief Observed by a man named N.W. Clerk. And he said he found this book to be very, very impressive and very, very profound. And I read it, and it turned out to be one of the shrillest expressions of religious disappointment that I had ever encountered. At least that's the way the first part of it started. Now, the interesting thing is that not long after that, I discovered that C.S. Lewis was in fact the author of that work, and that he had published it under a pseudonym, because it is so shrill in its acknowledgement of disappointment that he was afraid that many people who had come to faith through his writings might become disillusioned, because this little book, A Grief Observed, grew out of his experiences of losing his beloved wife, Joy Davidman. He had married her under most unusual circumstances. They'd had 4 wonderful years of marriage. Lewis was a bachelor until he was 56, and he says somewhere that amazingly what had been denied to him in his 20s and 30s, when most people get married, was graciously given him in his 50s. And then almost as soon as the gift was given, it was taken away. And he grieved mightily in the wake of Joy Davidman's death from cancer. And he was a journaler, and he wrote down carefully what he was fearing and feeling and thinking. And right before his own death, which you may remember was the same day President Kennedy was assassinated, on the very same day, Aldous Huxley, John Kennedy, and C.S. Lewis all died the same day. Imagine that convergence on the gates of eternity with those 3 very different people. But anyway, it was right after, it was before his death that he was persuaded to publish this part of his journal. And as I said, because he probably was the most famous convert to the Christian faith in the 20th century, and he took that very seriously, that's why he published it under the pseudonym. And the reason I'm telling you this is that as I read that book, I remember having a genuine sense of awe, because it raised the question to me, at that time a practicing minister, how can we speak of Christian hope and not set people up for disappointment? Lewis makes it very clear in the beginning of the book that he felt like he had been sold a bill of goods. He felt like he'd been promised something out of his religious resources in relation to grief, and when he got into the valley of the shadow of loss, it had not materialized. And so the way you feel when the promise is not kept, the way you feel when the altar on which you've rested your expectations doesn't prove to be strong enough to support them, that's how the book begins. Now, the interesting thing is that Lewis, because he's such a profound thinker, begins in the middle of the book to realize that maybe the problem was his expectations and not what had actually happened. You see, he had constructed ahead of time what he thought ought to happen, and it didn't happen that way, and that's why he got so upset. But when he begins to cleanse the lens of his perceptions and begins to take back his expectations and look with more virginal eyes on what actually happened, he discovers that God had given him refuge and strength, but because it was so different, he had missed it. And so the book ends on a more hopeful note than it began. But when I put it down, and I remember a vivid encounter with the book, I found myself asking, how can we handle the promises of God responsibly? Or to make it more simple, what can we really expect of God in the living of our lives and as we proceed, each one of us, into the unknown future? Now, anybody that knows the biblical canon knows that there are incredible promises of help originating in the divine mystery behind it all. The psalmist described God as our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. St. Paul says, "My God will supply all of your needs according to his riches and glory." The first promise that was made to Abraham at the time of the covenant was initiated was, "I will provide. I will go with you, and I will make provision for you as you make your way." And then that verse that has been so significant in my own life, that promise at the last part of the 40th chapter of Isaiah. "They who wait upon the Lord," says the great prophet, "those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Now, if words mean anything at all of these things converge around the expectation that as you and I make our way through history, there is going to be a divine interaction in our lives. God is going to do things. God is going to be present. God is going to provide. And God is going to be a help to us, particularly in the times when we cannot help ourselves. If these words mean anything like what we take them to mean, then there is the promise that you and I are not alone. But as we make our journey, there is one who cares about us, who does have the power, the wisdom, and the willingness to be of help to us. Now the question is, how can we think of these promises of divine help and not set ourselves up for the kinds of disappointment that C.S. Lewis chronicles so movingly in that little document? Well, that was back in the middle 60s, and I will confess to you now that for 35 years, as a person who has struggled himself, and as one who's wanted so much to be of help to other struggling people, I have really tried to ask that question from all different angles. I've tried to come at it from all different ways. And what I want to do tonight is simply share with you. It's not going to be brand new, because I've been working on this and working out of this now for 3.5 decades. And I've said many of these things to you on many occasions. But what I want to try to do is to give you my frame of reference, my theological grid, as you were, about what we can expect of God that will not result in our being disappointed and disillusioned. It's bad enough to have to suffer grief, but to feel like you've been let down or that you've bought a bill of goods, that only adds to the pain. So I want to restate tonight. I think many of you, will have heard parts of this, and I'm saying in advance that this represents 3.5 decades of theological reflection and efforts to adjust and to learn and to refine. But I want to suggest to you how I think we can handle responsibly the promises of God, or to put it another way, I think there is a secret of how we can exercise this power of expectation that will lead to genuine satisfaction and not disappointment. Now the key, I'm going to say again and again, the key, in my judgment, is to realize that according to Holy Scripture, there's not just one way that God is our refuge and our strength. But as I look at the whole sweep of the biblical revelation and at my own experience, I think there are 3 distinct forms of the grace to help us in our time of trouble. I think that the divine enters history in 3 very different ways. And the corrective against being disappointed is to provide a wide enough parameter of your sense of God's ways with us humans, that if you put all 3 of these together, then that gives you a full orb sense of expectation, and it protects you against thinking too narrowly about the divine and therefore setting yourself up for disappointment. Now, what are the 3 ways that I think the divine energies can be counted on to be a part of our everyday history? Well, the first is what I've called many times events of intervention, of rescue, and of miracle. I think there are times for God's own inscrutable purposes that God chooses to break in from transcendent dimensions and alter the circumstances in which we find ourselves and genuinely change the agenda that we're facing. The illustration that I often use for this is that section in Mark's Gospel where Jesus is walking. This is relatively early in his ministry. And he hears a voice calling to him from a distance, and the voice is filled with pathos. The voice says, "Jesus, Son of David, if you will, you can heal us. Have mercy on us." And Jesus traces the voice back to a pitiful, pitiful colony of lepers who were way off at a distance. Leprosy, remember, was the most devastating disease of first century life. It was considered so contagious that the minute you were diagnosed, you were quarantined away from everybody else. You were taken away from your family. You couldn't go into the temple. You had to live at a discreet distance from everybody. And if you did walk down the streets, you were under law commanded to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," so everybody could clear the space and not get close to you. Leprosy is that terrible kind of disease that is not instantly fatal. It is a slow rotting of the flesh, usually around the hands. Oftentimes the facial skin rots away slowly. It's a disfiguring disease. It is a slow debilitating of one's natural energies. It's about the worst thing that could happen to anybody. And so here is Jesus, who has begun to get a reputation as having divine energies. Here he is being addressed at a distance. "If you will, Son of David, take pity on us, have mercy on us, and heal us." And in that story, Jesus turns and faces the direction of those voices and says, "I do care about you, and I do have the power to heal. Be healed of your leprosy." And to their absolute amazement, they looked down, and the process of the disease was instantly reversed. The skin began to form on their fingers as it had in their mother's womb. Pretty soon they were back in the very condition of wholeness into which they had been born into this world. There was an energy from the beginning, from outside that situation, that broke in. And just as God created the world out of nothing in the beginning, so lo and behold, for reasons of God's own, he chose to recreate and to bring back to wholeness in a matter of seconds. Now, one of the things that I've repeated again and again in my 12 years here is something I learned from St. Augustine that I have found so helpful when it comes to this whole concept of the miraculous. Since we humans have learned to be scientific, that is, learned to describe empirically the things that we happen, the category of miracle has fallen into great suspicion. There are many, many people that say The age of miracles simply was when people didn't understand the way we understand today. But now that we understand the laws and dynamics of reality, there is no such thing as the miraculous. The world is an unending engine of cause and effect, and if you knew enough, there's a human or natural cause for everything. There's no need to inject any kind of divine dimension into anything. Now, Augustine has helped me because I, like you, have been shaped by the scientific mindset. Augustine has helped me enormously because he says, and you've heard me say this before, I imagine, that miracles, as you find them in the Bible and as you experience them in our own life, have more to do with timing than with anything else. He says miracles are those moments when, for God's own reason, He chooses to do instantly what He usually does at a more deliberate pace. He said, for example, water is always being turned into wine. It has been happening since seed time and harvest began on this planet. A grape seed is put into the ground, rain comes down and it swells the seed, and the seed sends up a plant, and then the plant has leaves, and then on the leaves there comes fruit, and in due time the fruit ripens, and the grape is taken, and is put in a vat, and it is pressed, and over a period of months and even years, water is always being turned into wine. Now, my dear mother would have hated to have heard that because she didn't think that there ought to be such a thing as wine. You probably heard me tell about the WCTU, the lady that was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and somebody said, now how do you account for the fact that your Lord changed water into wine? She said, I'd have thought a lot more of it. He hadn't done that. It was something outside the lines of what she wanted. But the point being, water is always being turned into wine over the slow, deliberate processes of the seasons. At the wedding feast of Cana in Galilee, for reasons that none of us can fathom because they are in the inscrutable wisdom of God, God chose to do quickly what God usually does at a more deliberate pace. Again, Augustine said, every time a farmer plants a seed and 1,000-fold come of it, every time fish swim back upstream and spawn millions of eggs, loaves and fishes are always being multiplied. It is happening right now as we sit here. But there on the plain with 5,000 men, for reasons of God's own, He chose to do instantly what He usually does at a slower pace. Now, what I like about Augustine's frame of reference is that it reminds us that in the final analysis, everything is miraculous, that anything exists, that anything stands out of the nothingness, which is what the word exist literally means, that anything is, and that anything has being and significance. That is a towering miracle. And the truth is, the very fact that things are is a greater mystery than how slowly or how quickly they come about. Paul Tillich claims he was set on his religious pilgrimage when as an adolescent he was confronted by the question, why something and not nothing? Where did this world come from? How does anything exist or be? And if you look at that mystery long enough, you have to come to the conclusion that between non-being and isness, there is that one creative connecting link, which is what we call God. That everything hangs like a chandelier on the fact that God wanted that to be, and God had the power to bring out of nothingness this entity of existence. So, I want to say tonight again, and I've said it many times, I really do believe in the possibility of miracles. I really do think that there are times that things happen in history that we simply can't account for them in terms of human agency or physical causality. They are things that occur that leave us in what my old black preacher friend used to call slack-jawed amazement. We simply can't explain from what we know as to how this moment has become that moment, except somehow the mystery of the divine has chosen to enter into the history in which we live and alter the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So, the first thing that I want to say is that I think one of the things we have a right to expect of God, one of the ways that we have a right to open our windows toward the future, is that there are times when God chooses to break in from above and do things for us that we cannot account for in any other way. And I really and truly believe that this is a part of the history of which we live. But having said that I do believe in the reality of miracles, the two other things that I need to say, and I've tried to say these before because I think they're protectives, and that is that the first thing I want to say about the miraculous, which I do believe in, is that this is the first hope any of us always articulate when we find ourselves up against it. When we find ourselves cornered, when we find ourselves at the end of our rope, when we find ourselves up against something that is totally beyond our capacity to do anything about. Checkmate is the way some people have described it. Entrapment, absolute up against a wall in which we're totally the prisoner. Our first impulse in those moments of entrapment is to want God to do miracle and therefore rescue and solve our problem for us. And I think there's a very good reason about why that's our first instinctive desire. Because if you'll think about it, given the condition that we were born into this world in, that is, as helpless infants, full of need but with very little abilities to meet our needs, the first experience of hope and help that ever came to us was in the form of intervention and rescue. All I could do when I was born in this world was to cry. All I could do about my needs was to begin to make a noise that would let my parents know that I had some kind of unmet need. And if those big people had not responded to me in some kind of caring, I would not have survived. You and I, every one of us, are the products of somebody caring us enough when we came out of the womb to pick us up and wash us off and begin to feed us and begin to hold us and begin to do those things for us that we cannot do for ourselves. Therefore, should it be any surprise that when we find ourselves, even as adults, in that same kind of helpless condition, that ancient memory of crying and help from outside, intervening and rescuing us, that lives on no matter how old you get to be. So I think it is perfectly understandable that when I am really at the end of my rope, my first hope, my first desire is that energies that are greater than I am will break in and solve my problems for me. And therefore I don't think you should be ashamed. I don't think you should be surprised, no matter how old you are, how mature you may think you are, that if you find yourself genuinely up against it, in a tight spot which you cannot deliver yourself from, your first instinct is going to be cry out to God and beg God to break in from above and solve your problems for you. Now it's interesting to me, when Jesus was at the height of his maturity, I mean, he was within hours of his own death. And remember, we think he was about 33, which back in that day and time was pretty much the lifespan of a person. At the height of his maturity, Jesus did the same thing to this Abba reality that he called God. He did the same thing to God that those lepers had done for him years before. That is, there in the garden, as he faced this incredible prospect of being tortured, of being rejected, of being killed. And it was overwhelming as he thought about it. Out of the deep place of his heart, he said, Father, all things are possible to you. Please take this cup from me. Do something from your vantage point to deliver me out of what it looks like I'm about to face. Jesus did the same thing to God the Father that the lepers had done for him, and it's not surprising. So don't ever feel ashamed if, when you're really up against it, that's what you most want. That's the oldest memory we have within us that is being applied to the situation of difficulty. So the first thing I want to say about the miraculous is that it is our most instinctive response to difficulty, because it was our first experience of being helped. The other thing I want to say about it, and this is so important, is that whereas I do believe in the miraculous, and I do think things like this happen again and again, miracle is not the only thing that is worthy of the word divine. Now, I have a great fear that television evangelists or people who tend to live way on the right side of the church have so talked about the reality of miracle that they have given people the feeling that if it's not a spectacular, miraculous healing, then it's really not worthy of the name divine. And I think if you associate the divine grace to help in time of trouble exclusively with the miraculous, I'm afraid there are going to be times that you're going to be disappointed. Because I believe with all my heart that sometimes this is the way God chooses to act, but this is not the only form of the grace to help in time of trouble. And the way not to experience disappointment, it seems like to me, is to hold fast to the reality of miracles, but then lay alongside those the two other ways that Holy Scripture say to us God uses these two to come into our lives and to be a grace to help us in our time of trouble. Now, what are the other two alongside intervention, rescue, and the miraculous? Well, the second, and I've talked about this many, many times, is what I call collaboration or partnership. There are times, for God's own mysterious reasons, that instead of breaking in from above and solving our problems for us, He comes alongside us in the midst of history and says, I want you to join with me. I want your energies, your creativity, your risking, your strength. I want you to join with me, and together I will solve this problem with you. I'm not going to do it for you. I'm going to do it with you. Now, if you think about it, that really is a more adult way of living life. But when we're little babies, things have to be done for us, but the whole goal of our growing is that we become participants ourselves so that we can join with the Creator, can even be co-creators sometime. I think a second way that the energies of God enter history are when you are inspired to see a problem and then realize that you can do something as well as expecting God to do something, that you can enter into collaboration with God, and that together you're going to bring about a solution to the difficulty. Now, the great biblical example of this is that whole second book of the Bible called the Exodus. It's a wonderful story of how the Hebrews who had fallen into slavery, after they'd gone down there during Joseph's time, and Joseph had passed from the scene, and the Jewish people multiplied very fast, and they're ingenious, wise people, and it set the Egyptians on the defensive, and so they began to, first of all, trying to curb the Hebrews, and then they reduced them to slavery. And they were trying very hard not to let their numbers increase. It was a very, very tortuous, oppressive time in the history of the descendants of Abraham. And you may recall that the chief figure in the Exodus saga is this wonderful, wonderful person called Moses. And when he was born, there was an edict out from the Pharaoh that every male Hebrew baby should be killed at birth. That was a way of holding population down. And somehow, Jochebed, Moses' mother, managed a civil disobedience. She somehow got him into the world without the Egyptians realizing it. And then because she was a slave and had to go every day to work somewhere, she had this ingenious way. She made a little float, a bamboo float, and they were obviously living right by the Nile River. And so she would put the little Moses infant in this float and put it around the bulrushes so that it wouldn't be seen, and she positioned as one of her older daughters to keep an eye on this. So she would go to work, and here this baby that was not supposed to have been allowed to live was beginning to survive in this very precarious situation. And one day, you can call it coincidence or you can call it providence. I choose the latter. The Pharaoh's daughter is down bathing in the Nile, and of all times, the little baby cries. And she hears the cry, and she goes over, and she finds this ingenious way that this Hebrew mother has managed to not only get the child born, but now to try to keep the child alive. And in that strange mystery of why oftentimes the children of a downtrodden race are exceedingly appealing to the people in the oppressing race. I remember in the South hearing my mother say that the babies of the wonderful African Americans that worked for us, aren't those babies cute? There was just something about an African American baby that seemed to, maybe that's the way the compassion of God compensates for our prejudice. At any rate, there on the spot, the Pharaoh's daughter, who I guess was used to having anything she wanted, no sense of limits, she decides to adopt this little child. And in defiance of her father's dictum, in defiance of all what the Egyptians were doing, she adopted this little child. And Miriam, the sister of Moses, was showing wonderful, wonderful Jewish ingenuity. She comes up and says, I know a woman that would be glad to be the nurse, the wet nurse for this child. I know a woman that would be glad to help you in these early days. And of course, it was his own natural mother that Miriam was suggesting. And so, out of this incredible event, the Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses, and he gets to be with his natural mother, and from them they taught him the traditions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But as he grew older, he got to go to the royal school. He got to be treated like a prince of Egypt. He was given this incredible, incredible education and opportunity, totally out of the blue. The Pharaoh's daughter loved him and gave him this opportunity. Well, he gets to manhood. His natural people are in slavery. Here he's had this great good fortune of being delivered. And you heard me say before that I think finally there are just two kinds of people in this world. Those who want to make the world a better place for everybody, and those who are content to make a better place for themselves and the world as it is. And if Moses had been that latter kind, and sad to say that's where most of us are, if he'd been that latter kind, he would have forgotten about the people that he came from who were languishing in slavery. And he would have just taken his good fortune as a matter of course and seized the opportunity and forgotten all about his forebears. But he was that rare, noble first kind who really cared for everybody and could not rest in his own privilege and see other people being left out and not want to do something about it. So Moses, at an early age, became burning with the desire to somehow help his people out of the condition in which they found themselves. And like so many young adolescents, we saw this so much back in the 60s, he honestly thought that violence was a way to solve social problems, that you could somehow cut the Gordian knot of historic injustice by simply picking up the sword and doing something violent. And one day he saw an Egyptian overlord mistreating a Hebrew, and it fired his indignation. And so he kills him with his own hands. Moses kills this Egyptian. And I guess he thought that that would be a spark to start a revolution and get all the Hebrews to rise up. But truth be told, they didn't know who he was. They didn't know this one because he'd been living most of his life up in the palace. And the Egyptians, of course, were very, very upset that this person, this outsider, this Hebrew, that they'd given all these advantages, is suddenly turning into a revolutionary and acting against them. And so they put out the word that this man has got to be done away with. And so to save his life, he has to flee into the desert wastes that are east of Egypt, what is called Sinai. And there, with all this Egyptian education, with all of this chance to be a royal prince, absolutely down the drain. His own people rejected him. The Egyptians were suspicious of him. And Moses' life takes this incredible turn that looks for all the world like it is absolutely a waste. Because for 40 years, he associated with some Midianites. They were itinerant shepherds on those wastes of Sinai. And he spent 40 years tending sheep, not realizing that God was preparing him through that kind of experience to learn like the back of his hand the topography across which he would later have to lead the children of Israel. I simply want to pause and say God may be preparing you for things right now that you don't even have any inkling of lie in your future. I don't think God wastes anything. I think God has a way of taking even our worst mistakes and somehow finding a way to use them. So for 40 years, Moses is nothing but an itinerant shepherd. Marries a Midianite lady, has children. It looks like for all his great idealism that he was never going to be able to do anything for the Hebrews. And one day he sees a bush burning, which was not unusual. The desert is extremely hot. But what was unusual, this bush burned and continued to burn. It wasn't being consumed. And one of the great things about Moses was that he still had curiosity. He was still wondering about things. And so the Bible says that he pulled aside to examine more closely this phenomenon that he couldn't understand. And when God saw that the sense of wonder and curiosity was still alive in him, out of the burning bushes, you know so well, the voice of Yahweh spoke, called Moses by name, told him to take off his shoes, The ground on which he stood was holy ground. And then he said, the time has come to do what you tried to do 40 years ago, but the people were not ready for it. But now the time is ripe. Israel is ripe. Egypt is ripe. Now is the time to set these people free. And so I want you to go down, and I will go with you. And I want you to confront Pharaoh and say to him, let my people go. Well, it's interesting what 40 years had done to the young idealist. He had lost all of his brashness, all of his confidence. And so you may remember that his first reactions was say, not me, not me. I can just hear him saying that. Now, wait a minute, God. I know that Pharaoh. I was in prep school with him. We were in the same fraternity. I sat side by side with him. He's not about to let this free labor pool go. And God said, look, Moses, you wanted to do something for your people. I want to do something. I'm not going to do it for them. I'm not going to do it for you. I'm going to do it with you. You've got to have the courage to go and face up to Pharaoh. You've got to have the courage to go and try to mobilize these people. You have got to put your stuff in with my stuff, because this is going to be a collaborative thing if it works at all. And, of course, that is the shape of this wonderful saga of the Hebrews eventually being delivered from Egypt. It took a lot of God, it took a lot of Moses, it took a lot of the people. And I want to say to you tonight that I honestly think that this is the form that God most often takes in becoming our refuge and our strength. That more often than not, the divine energies inspire us to become involved, inspire us to put our risk-taking, our creativity, our courage, our bodies, our resources. We have to put something into the process for the solution that we want to come about. It is a more adult way of God honoring us by asking us to be His partners and collaborators rather than staying infants and expecting God to do everything for us. But let's be honest. The infant in me continues to live. I have an infantile side of me that much prefers that everything be solved by somebody else. I would like for all my problems to be solved without it costing me anything. Let's be honest. That's a facet of our development that is always there. I know I've told you all about the beginner skier who got off by mistake on an advanced slope one time, and he was absolutely terrified. He sees all these black signs, and it looks like the precipice is just absolutely vertical. And sure enough, because he got so afraid, he lost his balance. He fell down. He was falling head over heels, skis going this way and that way. And out of his peripheral vision, he sees this tree, and he grabs out in panic, and he manages to stop his descent by holding on to this tree. Well, he is absolutely terrified. So there, hanging on this precipice, he cries out, God, God, please come and help me, help me. And this deep voice from above says, I will help you, my son. I will help you. Let go the tree, put on your skis, ski on down the hill. I will be with you. The man said, you don't understand, God. I'm a beginner skier. I'm here over my head. There's no way if I let go of this tree that I won't continue to fall. I can't put my skis on this kind of slope. You got to come down here and rescue me. And the boy said, I said, my son, I will help you. Let go the tree. Put on your skis and ski on down the hill. I will be with you. There was this long silence, and then the man said, is there anybody else up there? In other words, I prefer to be rescued than to have to put my own stuff into it. Now, Robert Ferry Capon makes the same point, and here again is one of the great stories that I love to tell, about the sexton in a Jewish synagogue. Came in one Friday afternoon and said to the rabbi, I'm quitting. I'm out of here. Don't believe in what we're doing anymore. As of today, I'm through. And the rabbi said, well, how can you do this? You're our most valued employee. You've been here 30 years. Why? He said, I've already told you. I don't believe in what we're doing. I don't think there's anything to it. The rabbi said, why do you say that? He said, I'll give you an example. He said, every Friday afternoon as the sun's going down and his Sabbath is about to begin, I have gone into our holy space where the 10 words of Moses are right there on the wall. And I have knelt down and I have said, well, the rabbi said, I don't think that's a fair test at all, but here it is Friday. Let's go in. I'll go with you. Maybe I can help you with your technique. So they go in, and the sun's about to go down, and there are the words of Moses, and this man kneels and says, Yahweh, Lord God of the universe, help me win the lottery. And from high up in the eaves, again, this big, deep voice says, Moshe, give me a break. Buy a ticket. Now, the whole point is, how are you going to win the sweepstakes? Asking God if you don't even... By the way, I'm not necessarily advocating the lottery, but I do know if we're going to have it, and if you're ever going to win, you're going to have to buy. You can't just pray. You can't just come up here in the chapel and expect that by itself to do it. The point I'm trying to make is, I think more often than not, God's way of coming into our situation is to join us side by side, put His energies alongside our energies, and do with us something that for His own wisdom He chooses not to do for us. And if you'll think about it, that's a high compliment that God is paying our maturity. But there's a third form, and I've talked about this probably more than anything else in my 12 years that I've been here. There's another way that the grace to help in time of trouble comes into history. It is the most often overlooked. It is the quietest and the least dramatic. But sometimes, instead of solving our problems for us, instead of solving our problems with us through collaboration, sometimes the grace to help us in our time of trouble comes in the form of giving us the strength to endure what we cannot change. And what change occurs is within us and not in the circumstances. Now, the biblical reference is St. Paul's thorn in the flesh. In his letters to Corinth, he tells that he's got some kind of physical problem, that he doesn't know what it is, but we don't know what it is, but it was causing him great, great grief. And he was begging God to heal him. He was, I'm sure, seeking out all the doctors that he knew how to seek out. I have not exactly what it was. My guess is, as I've said to you before, that he never recovered completely from the Damascus Road. And therefore he had a visual, optical problem. In his letter to the Galatians, he said, you all were so empathic with me that I remember you would have taken out your eyeballs and given them to me, because you sensed how I struggled with not being able to see. You remember he was blinded by that experience, and for 3 days was in total darkness. Maybe he never completely recovered the good use of his eyes, and it was such an impediment, and he begged God to take that burden off of him. But finally, as you know from that wonderful passage in 2 Corinthians, God says to him, Paul, I'm not going to take the thorn of the flesh from you. I'm not going to give you the collaborative resources to do it on your own. I'll tell you what I am going to do, Paul. I'm going to give you the grace sufficient to bear the thorn in the flesh. And what's going to change, Paul, is you and not the circumstances. And that's the least dramatic. It's so far from being rescued and having some kind of miraculous altering of our circumstances, to find ourselves in the same place day in and day out without any power of our own to change it. And all we're given is the power to endure. That seems like it is so little. And yet I want to suggest to you that I believe that that is as much a gift of the grace of God as the splashy, dramatic miracle. In fact, as you know, I'm going to tell you out of my own experience that I think sometimes the grace to help in our time of trouble takes the form of the gift of endurance. And if you've ever been where I've been, it is an incredible gift just to be able to barely stand and to keep on your feet even though nothing around you is changing. About 2 months after my little girl died back in 1970, I had slowly begun to pick up my ministerial responsibilities. I didn't have much heart for it, but I began to visit the hospitals and at last began to try to preach again. And I was down in the Methodist Hospital, I've told you this, in Louisville, Kentucky, and I bumped into a Jewish rabbi that I had a good friendship with, but I hadn't seen him since Laura Lou had died. And he told me how sorry he was. And then he startled me by saying, I need to ask you something. Honest Injun, man to man. Did God do anything for any of you in all that darkness that you've been through? Well, I was taken aback. I had not expected that kind of penetrating question there in the lobby of a hospital. And yet as I looked at him, there was an earnestness, there was a burning intensity in his eyes, and it dawned on me, this is no time for a glib, self-serving shibboleth. Here is one human being really wanting to know, out there in the darkness where it's almost unspeakable, is there any expression of the divine? Did God do anything for any of you? Well, I didn't answer him immediately. In fact, what I did was to stand there and go back over the last 20 months in my mind. And what I had to conclude, of course, was that though I had begged God, and thousands of people had joined me, I had begged God to heal Laura Lou, and would to God that he had, that had not occurred. We'd gotten the best medical collaboration we possibly could find. I have nothing but gratitude for all the doctors and nurses that were helping, but all that they knew were finally incapable of stopping the onslaught of that disease. So there had been no collaborative solution. But standing there in the lobby of that hospital, it came to me with a clarity like I'd never had before, that God had done something. What God had done was to give all of us the gift to endure. And in enduring, he had brought about changes in us that I don't know that would have ever come about in any other way. For example, the transformation that took place in my little daughter was absolutely amazing. She was 8.5 years old when this started. There's no way for me to describe what the last 5 months were like. Incredible, incredible suffering. And yet she developed a bravery. She developed a way of coping that was absolutely astonishing. If any of you have seen the little book that I wrote out of all that ordeal, I dedicated to Laura Lou with the words, a beautiful child, and in the end, a brave one. I have never seen more human bravery. And I have every confidence, if right there at the end, you had asked her, knowing what you do now about all the suffering that you've been through, would you like to just never have been born at all? I'm confident she would have said, even with all of its suffering, I wouldn't have taken anything but getting to be for these 10 years. That there was an incredible bravery in that little girl. I also had to remember that God had given me the grace to endure some situations that, looking back, I simply don't know how I was able to. There was one day toward the end where her veins had collapsed, and the young resident was trying to find a vein so he could make some kind of a transfusion, and he couldn't find it, and he kept sticking her, and she was crying and begging me to make the doctor stop hurting her, and I didn't know what to do. And in fact, it got so bad that her mother, who was on the other side of the bed, just fainted out of sheer horror at what was going on. And so here I was in a hospital room with a wife on one bed, a crying child on another, a resident who was trying but didn't know what he was doing. And I remember thinking, I can't stand this. I just want to run as far as I can away from all this pain that I cannot do anything about. I remember thinking, if I could just get away from this, I would give anything. But I want to tell you tonight that from somewhere beyond me came the power not to run away from those two people. I was able not to give up in despair or blow up in anger. I somehow was able just barely to stand in there. And the strength that I had never had before began to quietly emerge. And I've told you again and again that her death, her life and her death, have done more to change my life than any other single thing. I'm ashamed of this, but I took life pretty much for granted till Laura Lou got sick. I seem to think that my good fortune was somehow congenital entitlement that came to me. And it was not until I ran out of time and until something ended that I didn't want to end. It was not until I had gone through that experience that the sense of life is gift, the realization that everybody is here by generosity, and none of us are here by merit or deserving. A whole new sense of the mystery of graciousness has come to me through having to walk through that valley. I don't brag about it, but I am a different person than I was before all that happened. And I simply have to say, like I've heard so many other people say, that I don't, looking back, know how I got through it, but somehow I did, And I want to suggest that that somehow is the God who gives the gift of endurance. Now, I realize that that's not as dramatic. It's not what any of us want in our places of entrapment. But if you've ever been where I've been, to be given simply the grace to hang in there and not blow up or give up is an incredible, incredible gift. And what I want to say to you tonight, and I've said it many times before in these sacred walls, if you'll let your expectations of God include all three of these, if you'll be open to miracle, and there's not a thing wrong with begging for that, if you'll be open to collaboration, that you may be asked to constantly involve yourself, but if you'll also be open, that God may simply give you the grace to endure something, and the change that will take place will change you and not the circumstance. If you'll let all three of these comprise your sense of what you can expect of God, then I believe I can say to you honestly, you won't set yourself up for disappointment. Now, as I have put this together over many decades, it dawns on me there's nothing new about this. Centuries ago, the great prophet Isaiah understood exactly what I have slowly discovered. And in those words, it means so much to me that I've already quoted to you. They who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. There you have intervention and rescue, God lifting us out of our circumstances by God's transcendent grace. Or they shall run and not be weary. That's the collaboration, the activistic involvement of ourselves. Or they that wait upon the Lord shall walk and not faint, just barely able to stay on your feet, not making any visible progress, just barely able to stand. Now, some people say, well, Isaiah's got the sequence mixed up. It's first you walk, and then you run, and then you fly. But anytime somebody says that to me, I said, you haven't been where I've been. Because I remember when there was no place to fly, and there was no room to walk, no room to run, when being given the strength simply to stand there and not faint was incredibly appropriate potency. So my word tonight is, if you'll let, in the great mystery and wisdom of God, if you'll let all three of these comprise your sense of expectation, then I believe with all my heart you will not be disappointed. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. If you let all three make up your understanding of that word help, I believe with all my heart He'll see us through. Blessed be He. Amen.